Hi, my name's Genevieve Finch. When my grandfather Lucian passed away, my parents blocked me from attending his funeral, telling everyone I was too much of a disappointment to show my face. They had security escort me off the property, while the entire family watched. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was discovering they'd been telling people I was dead for over 2 years, collecting sympathy, and managing grandfather's affairs in my absence. How do you fight back when your own family erases you from existence? And why did my stepfather Cedrick's face go completely white when the funeral director stood up and said, "Before we conclude, Lucian Shaw left specific instructions to be read aloud, and he was very clear about who must be present to hear them." What happened next changed everything I thought I knew about my family, my grandfather, and why they really wanted me gone. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning air in Millbrook carried the kind of chill that makes you question whether you should have worn a heavier coat. I stood across the street from St. Augustine's Chapel, watching black cars pull into the circular driveway like a procession of grief dressed in chrome and polish. My grandfather Lucian Shaw was inside that building, lying in a mahogany casket I'd never been allowed to choose, surrounded by flowers I'd never been asked to select. I'd driven 12 hours straight from Portland to get here, surviving on gas station coffee and the stubborn belief that blood meant something. That 32 years of being Lucian's granddaughter had to count for more than whatever disappointment my parents thought I represented. I'd been wrong before, but never about something that mattered this much. My stepfather Cedrick Vance stood near the chapel entrance, like a bouncer at an exclusive club, checking his gold watch every few minutes. His salt and pepper beard was trimmed to corporate perfection, and his black suit probably cost more than my monthly rent. Even from across the street, I could see him scanning the crowd with the kind of authority that came from years of making decisions other people had to live with. My mother Thalia Vance emerged from a silver Mercedes wearing a black dress that managed to look both appropriate for mourning and expensive enough to make a statement. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a chignon that probably took her hairdresser an hour to perfect. She moved through the gathering crowd like she was hosting a charity gala, accepting condolences with practiced grace and just enough tears to look genuine without ruining her makeup. I crossed the street slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. The closer I got to the chapel, the more clearly I could hear the murmur of voices, the rustle of programs, the kind of subdued conversation that happens when people gather to remember someone who won't be coming home. My grandfather's voice should have been part of that murmur, telling stories that were half true and completely entertaining, making people laugh despite themselves. "Excuse me, miss," a security guard appeared at my elbow before I'd made it halfway up the stone steps. He was young, probably barely out of college, with the kind of earnest expression that suggested he genuinely felt bad about whatever he was about to say. "I'm going to need to see your invitation." Invitation? I stared at him. This is my grandfather's funeral. The guard glanced over his shoulder toward Cedrick, who had noticed our interaction and was making his way over with the determined stride of a man used to solving problems quickly and quietly. Behind him, Thalia continued greeting guests, but I caught her shooting glances in our direction. "There seems to be some confusion," Cedrick said, his voice carrying that particular tone of condescending patience he'd perfected during his 15 years of marriage to my mother. "This is a private service, Genevieve. Family only." "I am family," I said loud enough that several guests turned to look. Lucian Shaw was my grandfather. Cedrick's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Your grandfather made his wishes very clear about who should be present today. He wanted this to be a celebration of his life, not a circus." "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means," Thalia said, appearing beside Cedrick with the kind of perfect timing that suggested they'd rehearsed this conversation, "that disappointments stay home." The words hit like a physical blow. Around us, the crowd had gone quiet in that way that happens when people sense drama but aren't sure whether to look away or lean closer. I felt dozens of eyes on me, measuring, judging, probably wondering who I was and why I was causing a scene at someone's funeral. "Disappointments," I repeated, my voice steadier than I felt. "That's what you're calling me at my grandfather's funeral." "You made your choices, Genevieve," Thalia said, her voice soft but carrying clearly in the morning air. Lucian understood that actions have consequences. He wouldn't have wanted his final goodbye disrupted by someone who couldn't be bothered to visit him while he was alive. That was a lie, and we all knew it. I'd tried to visit Lucian dozens of times over the past 2 years. Every attempt had been blocked by Cedrick's secretary, by mysterious schedule conflicts, by sudden health concerns that required privacy. I'd sent letters that went unanswered, made phone calls that never got returned. I'd assumed my grandfather was angry with me for some reason I couldn't understand. It had never occurred to me that he might not be receiving my attempts to reach him at all. "Ma'am," the security guard said gently, "I'm going to have to ask you to leave the premises. You're having me physically removed from my grandfather's funeral," I said, looking directly at my mother. "In front of everyone, we're asking you to respect his wishes," Cedrick said, "and our grief." The security guard touched my elbow, not roughly, but with enough pressure to make it clear this wasn't a request. I looked past him toward the chapel doors, where I could see people filing inside, taking their seats for a service I'd been planning to attend since the moment I'd learned about Lucian's death 3 days ago. I'd found out from a neighbor, Mrs. Chen, who'd called me in tears because she'd assumed I already knew. She'd seen the obituary in the Millbrook Daily and couldn't understand why my name wasn't listed among the survivors. "Maybe it was a printing error," she'd said, but her voice carried the uncertainty of someone who suspected the error was intentional. "Please don't make this harder than it needs to be," Thalia said, and for a moment I thought I heard something that might have been genuine sadness in her voice. But when I looked at her face, I saw only the careful mask of a woman who'd learned to manage public appearances above all else. I let the security guard escort me down the steps and across the street to my car, a 10-year-old Honda that looked pathetic next to the luxury vehicles crowding the chapel's parking area. Behind me, I could hear the murmur of conversation resuming, people moving inside, life continuing as if I'd never been there at all. I sat in my car for 20 minutes, watching through the chapel windows as figures moved around inside. I caught glimpses of Lucian's casket at the front of the room, surrounded by enough flowers to stock a nursery. I wondered who had chosen them, whether anyone had remembered that his favorites were white roses, not the elaborate arrangements of lilies and chrysanthemums I could see from here. When the service ended, people began emerging from the chapel in small groups, talking quietly, checking their phones, beginning the transition from formal mourning back to regular life. I watched my mother and stepfather work the crowd, accepting final condolences, making arrangements for the reception I presumably wasn't invited to either. That's when I saw him. The funeral director, a tall man with silver hair and a gentle face, was standing near the chapel entrance with a leather portfolio in his hands. He was scanning the crowd with the kind of focused attention that suggested he was looking for someone specific. When his eyes found my car across the street, he nodded once and began walking in my direction. I rolled down my window as he approached, noting the careful way he moved, like someone caring. "Miss Finch?" he asked, and I nodded. "My name is Daniel Wilde. I'm the funeral director here at St. Augustine. I wonder if we might have a word." "I think I've had enough words for one day," I said, but something in his expression made me reconsider. "What about?" He glanced back toward the chapel, where Cedrick and Thalia were still engaged in conversation with a group of elderly women who had probably known Lucian for decades. "Your grandfather left some very specific instructions regarding his service. Instructions that haven't been followed." My heart began beating faster. "What kind of instructions?" "The kind that legally require your presence," Daniel said quietly. "And I suspect that's exactly why certain people hoped you wouldn't show up today." Daniel Wilde suggested we meet at a small cafe called Rosewood Corner, about 10 minutes from the chapel. It was the kind of place that served coffee strong enough to wake the dead and homemade pie that could make you forget your troubles, at least temporarily. We chose a corner booth away from the lunch crowd, and Daniel spread several documents across the table between us, like he was laying out evidence. "Before we discuss your grandfather's instructions," he said, stirring sugar into his coffee with deliberate care, "I need to understand something. When was the last time you spoke with Lucian Shaw?" The question hit harder than I'd expected. 2 years, 3 months, and 16 days ago, I said without hesitation. Not that I've been counting. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Daniel's eyebrows rose slightly. "That's very precise. It was my 30th birthday. He called me at 7 in the morning because he said 30 was too important a milestone to let pass without hearing his voice first thing." I wrapped my hands around my coffee mug, using the warmth to steady myself. "He told me he was proud of me for starting my art therapy practice, even if the rest of the family thought it was impractical. He said creativity was the closest thing humans had to real magic. And after that call, nothing. Radio silence. I tried calling him dozens of times, but Cedrick's people always had some excuse. Lucian was resting, or traveling, or seeing doctors who required complete privacy. I sent letters to his house, but they went unanswered. I even drove down here twice, but the gates were locked and no one would answer the intercom. Daniel nodded slowly, making notes on a yellow legal pad. What did your parents tell you about his condition these past 2 years? That he was declining rapidly, early-stage dementia that was progressing faster than expected. They said he was having trouble recognizing people, getting confused about time and place. Thalia told me he'd specifically asked not to see anyone outside immediate family because it upset him too much. And you believed that? I stared at him. Why wouldn't I? They're his family too. I assumed they were protecting him. Daniel pulled a folder from his portfolio and opened it carefully. Inside were medical records, pharmacy receipts, and what looked like several handwritten letters. Genevieve, your grandfather's medical records show no signs of dementia or cognitive decline. His last neurological evaluation, conducted just 6 weeks ago, shows him as mentally sharp as someone 20 years younger. The cafe suddenly felt too warm. I loosened my coat and tried to process what he was telling me. That's impossible. Why would they lie about something like that? I suspect it has to do with control, Daniel said gently. Control over Lucian's medical decisions, his financial affairs, and most importantly his will. He pulled out one of the handwritten letters. The paper was cream-colored and expensive, covered in the familiar slanted script I'd known since I was a little girl copying letters from Lucian's fountain pen practice sheets. This letter is dated 3 weeks ago, Daniel said. Your grandfather brought it to me personally, along with very specific instructions for his funeral service. I read the first few lines and felt the world tilt sideways. Dearest Genevieve, if you're reading this, then my worst fears have been confirmed. They've kept you away from me, just as I suspected they would. I need you to know that not a day has passed without me thinking of you, and wondering how you're managing without our conversations. He knew, I whispered. He knew they were blocking my contact. Keep reading, Daniel said. I've been pretending to be sicker than I am for months now, letting them think they're successfully managing my affairs, while I gather evidence of what they're really doing. The dementia story was their idea, not mine. It gives them power of attorney over decisions I'm perfectly capable of making myself. But more than that, it gives them an excuse to isolate me from the one person they've always seen as a threat to their plans. My hands were shaking by the time I finished the letter. Lucian had been sharp, alert, and completely aware that my parents were systematically cutting him off from the outside world, while telling everyone, including me, that he was losing his mind. There's more, Daniel said, pulling out another document. This is a copy of the will Cedrick and Thalia filed with the probate court last week. I scanned the document quickly. It was straightforward enough. The bulk of Lucian's estate, including his house in the historic district, his investment portfolio, and his art collection, went to Thalia. Smaller bequests to various charities, a trust fund for any future grandchildren, though none currently existed. My name appeared nowhere on the document. And this, Daniel said, producing another will with a different date, is the version Lucian filed directly with me, along with instructions that it not be revealed until after his funeral service had concluded, and only if you were present to hear it. This will was completely different. The house went to me, along with the majority of his investments, and his entire art collection, which I knew was worth several $1 million. Thalia received a substantial but smaller inheritance. Cedrick, who wasn't actually a blood relative, received nothing except a pointed note that step-family relationships could end as easily as they began. The will your parents filed is dated 6 months ago, Daniel explained. This one is dated 2 weeks ago, and includes a notarized statement from Lucian's doctor confirming his mental competency at the time of signing. I set the documents down carefully, afraid I might tear them. So they've been planning this for months. The isolation, the fake medical condition, probably even blocking my attempts to visit. It appears so, and there's something else you should know. Daniel's expression grew even more serious. According to Lucian's private investigator, your parents have been telling people in your grandfather's social circle that you died in a car accident 18 months ago. The words didn't register at first. They seemed too absurd, too extreme to be real. They told people I was dead. Car accident in Oregon. Very tragic. Closed casket service. They've been accepting sympathy cards and flowers for over a year. Several of Lucian's friends mentioned it to him, which is how he learned what they were doing. I thought about the past 18 months, the way certain family friends had stopped responding to my Christmas cards, the odd silences when I'd run into people from Millbrook during my rare visits to the area. I'd assumed they were just busy, or had forgotten me. It had never occurred to me that they thought I was dead. That's why he hired the private investigator, Daniel continued. He wanted to know exactly what they were telling people, and why his granddaughter had seemingly vanished from his life without explanation. What did the investigator find? Evidence that Cedrick has been systematically intercepting your mail, blocking your phone calls, and spreading the death story to anyone who might question your absence. He's also been managing Lucian's social calendar, controlling who could visit and when. I leaned back in the booth, trying to absorb the full scope of what had been done to me. Not just excluded from my grandfather's life, but erased from it so completely that he'd been living with the belief that I might actually be dead. Why? I asked. What could they possibly gain from keeping us apart? Daniel glanced around the cafe, then leaned closer. Money, obviously, but more than that, your grandfather was considering changing his living situation. He'd been talking about moving to a smaller place, maybe even out of state to be closer to you. He'd also been asking questions about his financial statements, wanting to understand exactly how his assets were being managed. Managed by whom? Cedrick. Your stepfather has had increasing control over your grandfather's finances for the past 3 years. Power of attorney for financial decisions, access to investment accounts, authority to make changes to insurance policies. The picture was becoming clearer and uglier by the minute. Cedrick hadn't just been keeping me away from Lucian, he'd been positioning himself as the primary beneficiary of a very wealthy man's estate, while simultaneously convincing that man's social circle that his closest living relative was dead. That's fraud, I said. Multiple kinds of fraud. Yes, it is, and your grandfather knew it. That's why he made these arrangements with me. He wanted to make sure the truth came out, regardless of what happened to him. Daniel handed me one final document. This is your grandfather's final request. The one that was supposed to be read aloud at the conclusion of today's service, in front of all the people who've been lied to about your death. I read it twice before the words sunk in. Lucian Shaw's final request was simple but devastating. He wanted the truth about my alleged death to be revealed publicly. He wanted his real will to be read aloud, and he wanted me to be given the opportunity to speak about our relationship to anyone who would listen. They couldn't let that happen, I said quietly. No, Daniel agreed. They couldn't, which is why they tried so hard to keep you away from the service entirely. But I'm here now. Yes, you are. And according to your grandfather's instructions, that means it's time to give him the funeral he actually wanted. Daniel Wild pulled out his phone and began scrolling through his contacts with the focused determination of a man who'd been waiting for this moment. The reception is being held at the Oakwood Country Club, he said. Most of the funeral attendees will be there for at least another hour. What are you suggesting? Your grandfather was very specific about his final request. He wanted the truth revealed in front of his friends and family. The funeral service has concluded, but the reception provides the perfect opportunity to honor his actual wishes. I stared at him across the cafe table, surrounded by the remnants of our conversation, legal documents, medical records and handwritten letters that proved my family had been lying to me and everyone else for nearly 2 years. You want me to crash my grandfather's funeral reception and announce that I'm not actually dead. I want to help you honor your grandfather's final request, Daniel corrected gently. He spent the last months of his life planning this moment. He knew he couldn't confront the lies while he was alive without risking even more isolation, but he made sure the truth would come out after his death. What if they call security again? What if they have me arrested? Daniel smiled for the first time since we'd met. They can't have you arrested for being alive, Genevieve. And they certainly can't have you arrested for carrying out the legally documented final wishes of the deceased. 30 minutes later, we pulled into the circular driveway of the Oakwood Country Club in Daniel's pristine black sedan. The building was all white columns and red brick, the kind of place where Millbrook's wealthy families had been gathering for important occasions since before I was born. I'd been here exactly twice in my life, once for Thalia and Cedrick's wedding reception, and once for my high school graduation party, back when my parents still acknowledged my existence in public. Through the tall windows, I could see people moving around inside, holding cocktail glasses, and small plates of what was probably expensive catered food. The atmosphere looked appropriately subdued, but not devastated. These were people who'd known Lucian Shaw as a fixture in their community, but they weren't family. They were mourning the loss of a familiar face, not grieving the death of someone they couldn't imagine living without. Are you ready? Daniel asked, gathering his portfolio of documents. I smoothed my black dress and checked my reflection in the car's side mirror. I looked tired and stressed, which was probably appropriate for someone attending her grandfather's funeral reception. I also looked very much alive, which was going to be a shock for quite a few people inside that building. "Let's do this," I said. The country club's main reception room was decorated with the same elaborate flower arrangements I'd seen at the chapel, creating an atmosphere of expensive grief. Maybe 60 people were scattered around the room in small groups, speaking in the kind of hushed tones that accompany formal mourning. I recognized some faces from my youth, family friends, business associates, people who'd been part of Lucian's social circle for decades. Cedrick stood near the bar with a scotch in his hand, holding court with 3 other men in expensive suits. Thalia was across the room, accepting condolences from a group of women who looked like they belonged to the same garden club or charity board. Neither of them noticed me enter behind Daniel. "Ladies and gentlemen," Daniel said, his voice carrying clearly across the room, without being loud enough to seem disrespectful. "If I could have your attention for just a moment." Conversations gradually faded as people turned toward us. I saw the exact moment when Cedrick spotted me. His face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, and finally a kind of pale panic that suggested he understood exactly why I was there. "Before we conclude this celebration of Lucian Shaw's life," Daniel continued, "there are some final matters that need to be addressed. Mr. Shaw left very specific instructions regarding information that was to be shared after his service." Thalia had stopped mid-conversation, and was staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Several other people were looking back and forth between us, clearly puzzled by the tension that had suddenly filled the room. "What is this about?" Cedrick asked, setting down his drink, and moving toward us. "Daniel, we discussed the arrangements weeks ago. Everything has been handled according to plan." "Yes," Daniel said calmly. "Your plan." However, Mr. Shaw left additional instructions with me that were to be carried out regardless of any other arrangements. He opened his portfolio and pulled out the letter Lucian had written. "This document, notarized and legally binding, contains Mr. Shaw's final request regarding information he wanted shared with his friends and family." I watched Cedrick's face carefully as Daniel spoke. The panic was being replaced by something that looked like calculation, as if he was trying to figure out how to regain control of a situation that was rapidly spinning away from him. "I don't think this is the appropriate time or place," Thalia said, moving closer to Cedrick. "People are here to honor Lucian's memory, not to be subjected to whatever family drama." "Family drama," I repeated, finding my voice for the first time since entering the room. "Is that what you're calling it?" Several people near us stopped their conversations entirely, and turned to listen. I recognized Mrs. Beatrix Finch, who'd taught piano lessons to half the kids in Millbrook for 40 years. She was staring at me with the kind of intense confusion that comes from seeing someone you thought was dead. "Genevieve," she said uncertainly. "But I thought you were dead," I finished. "Yes, I've heard that story. It's very interesting." The room had gone completely quiet now. Even people who hadn't been part of our conversation were sensing that something significant was happening. Cedrick looked like he was calculating the distance between himself and the nearest exit. Daniel cleared his throat and began reading from Lucian's letter. "To my friends and family gathered to remember my life, I need you to know that I have not died, confused or isolated, as some people may have suggested. I have died angry and heartbroken, but completely aware of the lies that have been told about my granddaughter Genevieve." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Finch gasped audibly. An elderly man near the window said, "What lies?" Daniel continued reading. "Many of you have been told that Genevieve died in a car accident over a year ago. This is completely false. She is alive and well in Portland, Oregon, where she runs a successful art therapy practice. The story of her death was fabricated to prevent her from maintaining contact with me, and to exclude her from my will." "That's enough," Cedrick said loudly. "Daniel, this is completely inappropriate. These people are here to mourn, not to listen to baseless accusations." "Baseless?" I asked, my voice carrying clearly across the room. "Would you like to explain to Mrs. Finch why she sent a sympathy card to my mother when I died in a car accident that never happened?" Mrs. Finch's hand flew to her chest. "You mean I sent flowers and food for a year for someone who wasn't dead? You sent flowers and food for someone who was being systematically isolated from her dying grandfather," I said. "Someone who was told her grandfather was too sick to see her, while other people were being told she was too dead to visit him." The room erupted in confused conversations. People were looking back and forth between me and my parents, trying to understand what they were hearing. I caught fragments. "But the death certificate. I was at the memorial service. How is this possible?" There was no memorial service, Daniel said, raising his voice to be heard over the chatter. There was no death certificate. There was only a carefully constructed lie designed to keep a grandfather from his granddaughter, while his assets were systematically transferred to people who had no legal right to them. Cedrick made a move toward Daniel, but stopped when several people near him stepped back. The calculation in his expression was giving way to something closer to desperation. "This is absurd," Dalia said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Genevieve, if you're so concerned about your grandfather, where have you been for the past 2 years? Why didn't you visit him when he was sick?" "Because every time I tried, I was told he was too ill to see visitors," I said. "Every call was blocked. Every letter went unanswered. Every attempt to visit was turned away at the gate. I spent 2 years thinking my grandfather was angry with me, for some reason I couldn't understand. And I spent 2 years thinking my granddaughter might be dead," I continued, my voice growing stronger, "because that's what you told him when he asked why I'd stopped visiting." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the catering staff had stopped moving. Everyone in the room was staring at us, waiting to see what would happen next. Daniel opened his portfolio again, and pulled out the 2 wills. Shaw also left instructions regarding the reading of his actual will, as opposed to the fraudulent document that was filed with the probate court last week. "Now wait just a minute," Cedrick said, his voice rising. "You can't just yes," Daniel said firmly. "I can, and I will." That's when I realized my grandfather's final request wasn't just about exposing the lies. It was about giving me the chance to reclaim not just my inheritance, but my place in the community that had been told I no longer existed. The silence in the reception room stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap at the slightest pressure. Daniel held both wills in his hands, the documents that would either vindicate everything I just said, or expose me as someone trying to profit from false accusations. I could see Cedrick calculating his options, his eyes darting between the exits and the crowd of people who were waiting for answers. "This is completely improper," Dalia said, her voice sharp with desperation disguised as indignation. "Daniel, you know perfectly well that will readings are private family matters, not public spectacles." Actually, Daniel replied calmly, Mr. Shaw's instructions were very specific about this being a public reading. He wanted his friends to understand exactly what had been done in their presence.
Mrs.
Finch stepped forward, her face flushed with what looked like a combination of embarrassment and anger. "Thalia Vance, I brought casseroles to your house for 6 months after that girl supposedly died. I cried at what I thought was her memorial service. Are you telling me that was all lies?" "Beatrix, please," Thalia said. "You don't understand the full situation." "Then explain it," demanded a man I didn't recognize, probably one of Lucian's business associates, "because right now it sounds like you've been running some kind of elaborate con game using your own family." Cedrick moved closer to the center of the room, apparently deciding that offense was better than defense. "What you're witnessing is a desperate attempt by someone who was cut out of a will to cause chaos and pain during our time of grief. Genevieve abandoned her grandfather years ago, and now she's here making wild accusations because she's not getting the inheritance she feels entitled to." "Abandoned him?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I drove 12 hours to get here for his funeral, only to be told I was too much of a disappointment to attend." "You were told that because it's true," Cedrick shot back. "Where were you when he was in the hospital last Christmas? Where were you when he fell and broke his hip in February? Where were you during the months when he really needed family support?" The questions hit like physical blows because I didn't have answers that would satisfy this crowd. How could I explain that I hadn't known about any of those incidents? That no one had called me, that I'd learned about his health crises the same way I'd learned about his death, through third parties who assumed I already knew. "I wasn't told about any of those things," I said, my voice smaller than I wanted it to be. "Of course you weren't," Cedrick said, his voice growing more confident as he sensed weakness. "Because you'd made it clear that your art therapy practice in Portland was more important than your family obligations here." Daniel stepped forward, apparently sensing that I was losing ground. "Perhaps we should let Mr. Shaw's own words address these accusations," he said, pulling another document from his portfolio. "This is a letter he wrote to his attorney just 6 weeks ago, outlining his concerns about family interference in his personal relationships." He began reading in Lucian's distinctive voice, as captured in careful handwriting. "I have become increasingly concerned that my ability to maintain contact with my granddaughter is being deliberately sabotaged. When I ask about Genevieve, I am told she is too busy with her work to visit. When I attempt to call her, I am told she has changed her number. When I try to send letters, they are returned as undeliverable. That's not, Thalia began, but Daniel continued reading. I have hired a private investigator to verify my suspicions. The investigator has confirmed that my mail is being intercepted, my phone calls are being blocked, and various members of my social circle have been told that Genevieve died in an automobile accident. This is categorically false, as the investigator has confirmed that she is alive and well in Portland, Oregon. The murmur that went through the crowd was like wind through dry leaves. People were looking at Cedrick and Thalia with expressions that ranged from confusion to disgust. I saw several people pull out their phones, probably to check on information they could now verify. Furthermore, Daniel continued, I have reason to believe that my financial affairs are being managed in ways that do not reflect my wishes. Several investment changes have been made without my knowledge or consent, and I have discovered that powers of attorney I never signed have been filed with my bank. Cedrick's face had gone from pale to gray. Those documents were necessary for his medical care. He wasn't capable of managing complex financial decisions. Actually, Daniel said, that brings us to another interesting document. He pulled out what looked like a medical report. This neurological evaluation conducted just 6 weeks ago shows Mr. Shaw's cognitive function as completely normal for his age. No signs of dementia, no indicators of diminished capacity. That's impossible, Thalia said quickly. His doctors told us. Which doctors? Daniel asked. Because according to his medical records, Mr. Shaw's primary physician never diagnosed any cognitive decline. I watched my mother's face as she realized she'd been caught in a lie that was documented and verifiable. The careful mask of grieving widow was cracking, revealing something desperate underneath. The dementia story, I said, understanding flooding through me, was something you created to justify controlling his decisions. We were protecting him, Cedrick said, but his voice lacked conviction. He was becoming paranoid, suspicious of everyone. He was becoming suspicious because his mail was being intercepted, and his granddaughter was being told she was too much of a disappointment to attend his funeral. I said, my voice growing stronger. He was suspicious because people were managing his money without his consent and lying to his friends about his family. Daniel opened the legitimate will and began reading the relevant sections aloud. The room grew quieter with each bequest. The house to me, the art collection to me. The investment portfolio split between me and several charities, with a smaller portion going to Thalia. Nothing to Cedrick except a pointed note about step-family relationships ending as easily as they began. This will is dated 2 weeks ago, Daniel announced. It was signed in the presence of 2 witnesses and notarized by Mr. Shaw's attorney. His mental competency was verified by his physician on the same day. 2 weeks ago, Mrs. Finch said slowly. You mean he changed his will 2 weeks ago? He didn't change it, Daniel said. This is his will. The document filed with probate court last week was a forgery, designed to make it appear that Mr. Shaw had left his estate to people who had been systematically isolating him from his actual family. The room erupted in conversations again, but this time the tone was different. People weren't confused anymore, they were angry. I could hear fragments, fraud, elder abuse. How could they, poor Lucian? Cedrick made one last desperate attempt to regain control. Even if some mistakes were made in communication, that doesn't change the fact that Genevieve chose to stay away. She could have fought harder to see him if she really cared. Fought harder? I stared at him. I drove down here twice and was turned away at the gate. I called your office dozens of times and was told he was too sick for visitors. I sent letters that were returned as undeliverable to an address I knew was correct. How exactly was I supposed to fight harder against a system designed to keep me away? You could have, she could have what? Mrs. Finch interrupted, her voice sharp with anger. Hired a private investigator like Lucian did, because that's what it took for him to figure out what you were doing to his family. She could have gone to the police, Cedrick said weakly. And told them what? I asked. That my grandfather wasn't returning my calls, that my stepfather's office said he was too sick for visitors. What crime would I have reported? Daniel pulled out one final document. Actually, there are several crimes that can be reported now. Mail fraud, for intercepting personal correspondence. Financial fraud, for using forged documents to access bank accounts. Elder abuse, for isolating an elderly person from his family. An identity fraud, for spreading false information about someone's death. Are you threatening us? Thalia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm informing you of the legal consequences of your actions, Daniel replied. Mr. Shaw documented everything. He kept copies of intercepted mail, recorded phone conversations with people who asked about Genevieve's death, and maintained detailed records of financial transactions he never authorized. The room had gone completely silent again. Everyone was staring at Cedrick and Thalia, who looked like they were finally understanding the full scope of what they'd been caught doing. Ladies and gentlemen, Daniel said, addressing the crowd. Mr. Shaw's final request was that the truth be revealed so that his friends would understand what really happened during the last years of his life. He wanted you to know that he died feeling isolated and betrayed, but not confused or forgotten by the granddaughter he loved. I felt tears starting to form for the first time since this whole ordeal began. Not tears of sadness, but tears of relief that my grandfather had known the truth about my absence and had planned a way to expose the lies that had kept us apart. There's one more thing, Daniel said, looking directly at me. Mr. Shaw left a recording for you, Genevieve. A message he wanted you to hear after everything else had been revealed. He pulled out a small digital recorder and set it on the nearest table. He made this recording just 3 days before he died. My grandfather's voice filled the room, clear and strong, nothing like the confused, declining man I'd been told he'd become. And what he said would change everything I thought I knew about the last 2 years of his life. Daniel's finger hovered over the play button of the digital recorder for just a moment before pressing it. The room was so quiet I could hear the subtle hum of the air conditioning system and the distant sound of traffic outside. Then my grandfather's voice filled the space, as clear and vibrant as I remembered from our last conversation over 2 years ago. My dearest Genevieve, the recording began, and I had to grip the edge of the nearest table to steady myself. If you're hearing this, then my plan worked, and you're finally learning the truth about what's been done to both of us. The voice that emerged from the small speaker was nothing like the confused, deteriorating man Thalia and Cedrick had described. This was the Lucian Shaw I remembered, sharp, thoughtful, with the kind of quiet authority that came from years of making decisions that mattered. I want you to know that I never stopped thinking about you. Never stopped wondering why my bright, compassionate granddaughter had suddenly disappeared from my life. For months I believed the stories they told me. You were busy with your practice, focused on building your career, unable to find time for an old man's complaints. I felt tears starting to form as several people in the room glanced at me with expressions of sympathy and growing understanding. But then Mrs. Chen mentioned how sad she was about your death in that car accident, and I knew something was terribly wrong. You see, no one had told me you were dead. I was still waiting for you to call, still asking about you, still wondering why you'd grown so distant. Mrs. Finch made a small sound of distress, and I saw her reach for her purse, probably looking for tissues. That's when I started investigating. Lucian continued. That's when I hired Orion Reed, the private investigator whose reports are now part of the evidence Daniel is presenting today. And that's when I learned the full scope of what had been done to us. The recording paused, and I could hear my grandfather taking a careful breath before continuing. Genevieve, you need to understand that everything you tried to do to reach me was blocked. Every letter you sent was intercepted before I could see it. Every phone call you made was screened by people who told you I was too sick to talk, and told me you were too busy to care. They created a perfect system of isolation that kept us both believing the other had chosen to stay away. Jesus, someone whispered behind me. I turned to see a man I didn't recognize shaking his head in disgust. But the lies about your contact attempts were nothing compared to what they told my friends and social circle. Lucian's voice continued. For over a year, people in this community believed you were dead. They sent sympathy cards, they brought food, they shared memories of you at social gatherings while I sat there, still wondering why you wouldn't visit. Thalia had moved closer to Cedrick and was gripping his arm like she was trying to keep herself from collapsing. Several people in the room were staring at them with expressions that had moved well beyond confusion into open disgust. The cruelest part, Lucian said, was that I began to doubt my own memory. When person after person mentioned your tragic death, I started to wonder if my grief had made me forget. I even asked my doctor if memory loss could be so selective that I could forget something as significant as my granddaughter's death. Oh, Lucian, Mrs. Finch said softly, and I saw her wipe away tears. That's when I decided to pretend. The recording continued, and this revelation sent a new murmur through the crowd. I started acting more confused than I was, more dependent than I needed to be. I let them think they were successfully managing my decline while I gathered evidence of what they were really doing. I stared at the recorder, understanding for the first time the full scope of my grandfather's strategy. He hadn't been the victim of their manipulation, he'd been an active participant in documenting it. The financial fraud was extensive, Lucian continued. Powers of attorney I never signed, investment changes I never authorized, insurance beneficiaries I never designated. They've been preparing for my death for over 3 years, systematically transferring control of my assets while making sure the one person who might question their actions was either kept away or believed to be dead. Daniel pulled out another folder and spread its contents on the table next to the recorder. Bank statements, insurance documents, property transfer papers, all bearing signatures that looked like Lucian's, but were clearly forgeries when compared to authentic documents. I've documented everything, Lucian's voice said, as if he could see Daniel arranging the evidence. Orion Reed has copies of intercepted mail, recordings of phone calls where lies were told about your death, financial records showing unauthorized transactions, and medical records proving that my supposed cognitive decline was a fiction created to justify controlling my life. But more than the evidence, the recording continued. I want you to understand why this happened. It wasn't just about money, though money was certainly part of it. It was about control. It was about 2 people who saw my independence, and your connection to me as threats to their plans. I looked across the room at Cedrick, who was now pale gray, and kept checking his phone like he was considering calling someone for help. Cedrick married your mother 15 years ago, Lucian continued, just 6 months after his own company filed for bankruptcy. I should have seen the pattern then, but I wanted to believe that Thalia had found genuine love after your father's death. This was news to me. I'd been 12 when my father died, and 14 when Thalia married Cedrick. I'd never known about any business failures or financial problems. The pattern became clear when Orion investigated Cedrick's history. The recording went on. He'd been married twice before, both times to women with substantial assets. Both previous marriages ended in divorce, after mysteriously favorable financial settlements. Both ex-wives reported that family members had been turned against them during the marriage. He's a predator, someone in the crowd said clearly. He is, Lucian agreed, as if he'd heard the comment. And he saw in our family situation an opportunity for his biggest score yet. A wealthy elderly man with a single heir who lived far away and visited infrequently. All he had to do was isolate me from you, and establish himself as my primary caretaker and beneficiary. The recording paused again, and when it resumed, my grandfather's voice carried a different tone, something sadder but also more determined. The hardest part of this entire situation has been accepting that your mother allowed it to happen. I want to believe she didn't understand the full scope of what Cedrick was doing, but the evidence suggests she was an active participant in creating the lies that kept us apart. I looked at Thalia, who was now crying quietly but not in a way that suggested remorse. Her tears looked more like the frustrated crying of someone who'd been caught doing something she'd thought she was clever enough to get away with. Genevieve, Lucian continued, I need you to know that my love for you never wavered, even when I was told you were dead. Even when I started to believe it might be true. You've been the brightest light in my life since the day you were born, and nothing these people did could change that. Now I was crying openly, and I wasn't the only one. Mrs. Finch was openly weeping, and several other people in the room were wiping away tears. I've left you more than just money and property, the recording continued. I've left you the truth, documented and verified, so that you'll never have to wonder if you could have done something differently. You couldn't have. The system was designed to make contact impossible while making you both feel like the failure was personal. Daniel reached over and handed me a thick manila envelope I hadn't noticed before. This contains copies of everything, he said quietly. The intercepted letters, the financial records, the investigation reports, all of it. But most importantly, Lucian's voice continued. I've left you with proof that love doesn't always look like what we expect it to look like. Sometimes love looks like detective work. Sometimes it looks like patience and planning, and setting traps for people who think they're smarter than the people they're trying to hurt. I spent the last months of my life building this case not just for you, but for any other family members who might be facing similar situations. Elder abuse and family fraud are more common than people want to admit. and they work because they rely on isolation and the assumption that family members have each other's best interests at heart. The room was completely silent, except for the sound of my grandfather's voice, and the occasional sniffle from someone fighting back tears. My final request is simple. Use what I've given you not just to reclaim what was taken from you, but to help other people who might be facing similar situations. Use the house as a resource center. Use the money to fund legal aid for families being torn apart by predators. Use your art therapy skills to help people heal from the trauma of family betrayal. Make my death mean something more than just the end of one old man's story. Make it the beginning of a movement to protect vulnerable people from the family members who are supposed to protect them. The recording was nearly finished, but my grandfather had saved the most important words for last. And Genevieve, remember that you were never the disappointment they tried to make you feel like you were. You were the one thing in my life that never disappointed me, never let me down, never stopped being exactly the person I was proud to call my granddaughter. I love you, I've always loved you, and I'm sorry we lost 2 years, but I'm grateful we didn't lose forever. The recording clicked off, leaving the room in absolute silence. Daniel looked around at the crowd of people who had just heard the complete truth about what had been done to a man they'd known and respected for decades. Ladies and gentlemen, he said quietly, that concludes Mr. Shaw's final request. The legal proceedings for the estate will begin tomorrow morning, and criminal charges are being filed this afternoon. That's when Cedrick finally broke his silence. But what he said wasn't an apology or an explanation. It was a threat that would make everything even worse. You want to know the truth, Cedrick said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. The truth is that your precious grandfather was a manipulative old man who couldn't stand the idea of losing control, even from his deathbed. The room reacted with a collective intake of breath. Several people actually stepped backward, as if Cedrick's words were physically repulsive. Mrs. Finch looked like she'd been slapped. And you, he continued, pointing directly at me, you're just a greedy opportunist who couldn't be bothered to visit while he was alive, but now wants to cash in on his death. Daniel started to speak, but Cedrick wasn't finished. You think you're so smart with your recordings, and your private investigators, and your dramatic funeral revelations. You have no idea what you're dealing with, Cedrick Thalia said urgently, tugging at his sleeve. Stop talking, but something had snapped in Cedrick's carefully maintained facade. The desperation and panic were being replaced by a kind of reckless anger that suggested he'd decided he had nothing left to lose. You want evidence? He asked, pulling out his phone. Let me show you some evidence. He began scrolling through his contacts with shaking fingers. I've got proof that Lucian Shaw was losing his mind long before we took any action to protect his assets. I've got recordings of him talking to people who weren't there, medical records showing early-stage dementia, psychiatric evaluations proving he was becoming a danger to himself. Those are forgeries, Daniel said calmly. We've already established that Mr. Shaw's actual medical records show no cognitive decline. Are they? Cedrick asked, his voice taking on a manic edge. Because I've got Dr. Harrison Mills right here in my contacts, and he'll be very interested to know that someone's been claiming his medical evaluations are fake. He hit the call button and put the phone on speaker. The room waited in tense silence as the phone rang once, twice, 3 times before a gruff voice answered. Cedrick, what the hell are you calling me for? I told you we were done with this arrangement. The blood drained from Cedrick's face as he realized what he'd just done. Several people in the room had pulled out their own phones and were clearly recording the conversation. Mills, Cedrick said, his voice suddenly much quieter. I need you to confirm the psychiatric evaluation you conducted on Lucian Shaw. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Are you insane? I'm not confirming anything. You paid me to write reports I'd never actually conducted on a patient I'd never actually examined. That's fraud, you idiot. The room erupted. People were talking over each other. Phones were being raised to record better angles, and Cedrick was staring at his phone like it had betrayed him. Dr. Mills, Daniel said, stepping closer to the phone. This is Daniel Wild, funeral director at St. Augustine's Chapel. Am I correct in understanding that you were paid to create false psychiatric evaluations for Lucian Shaw? Who is this? Cedrick, what the hell is going on? Dr. Daniel continued. You should know that this conversation is being recorded by multiple people at Mr. Shaw's funeral reception, and your admission of fraud is being documented as evidence in a criminal investigation. The line went dead. Cedrick stared at his phone for several seconds before slowly looking up at the room full of people who had just heard him expose his own criminal conspiracy on speakerphone. "That proves nothing," he said, but his voice lacked any conviction. "Actually," said a new voice from the back of the room, "it proves quite a lot." Everyone turned to see a woman in a dark suit making her way through the crowd. She was holding up a badge, and her expression was all business. "Detective Amelia Hayes, Millbrook Police Department," she announced. "I've been listening to this conversation from the hallway for the past 10 minutes, and I think we need to have a more formal discussion about some of these allegations." I stared at her, wondering how and why a police detective had shown up at my grandfather's funeral reception. "Detective Hayes," Daniel said, "I'm glad you could make it. I called the department about an hour ago to report suspected fraud and elder abuse, but I didn't expect such a quick response." "Well," Detective Hayes said, "when someone reports that a deceased person's funeral is being used to expose a multi-year criminal conspiracy, we tend to prioritize that call." She looked around the room, taking in the scattered documents, the digital recorder, and the faces of roughly 60 people who had just witnessed what amounted to a public confession. "Vance," she said, addressing Cedrick directly, "I'm going to need you to come with me to answer some questions about financial fraud, elder abuse, identity theft, and now what appears to be conspiracy to commit medical fraud." "This is harassment," Cedrick said, but he was backing toward the wall like a cornered animal. "These people are making false accusations based on fabricated evidence. The evidence includes your own phone call, which was recorded by multiple witnesses," Detective Hayes pointed out. "But let's discuss that downtown. That's when Thalia made her own desperate play." "Officer, you don't understand the full situation. Genevieve has been estranged from this family for years. She's making these accusations because she's angry about being written out of the will." "Actually, ma'am," Detective Hayes said, "I've been briefed on the situation by Mr. Wilde and the private investigator, Mr. Reed. We've already verified that the reports about Miss Finch's death were false, and we've confirmed that mail addressed to Mr. Shaw's residence was being intercepted and redirected." She pulled out a small notebook and flipped it open. "We've also pulled records from the post office showing that someone has been filing change of address forms for mail sent to Miss Finch, redirecting her correspondence to a P.O. box registered under a false name." I felt like the ground was shifting beneath my feet. "They were intercepting my mail too. Any letters you sent to your grandfather's address were being rerouted before they reached him," Detective Hayes confirmed. "And any letters he might have tried to send to you were being collected by someone else." Cedrick made a sudden move toward the exit, but Detective Hayes was faster. "Mr. Vance, I really do need you to stay put while we sort this out." "This is insane," Cedrick said, his voice rising to nearly a shout. "You're taking the word of a disgruntled family member and a funeral director with an agenda over the people who actually cared for Lucian Shaw during his final years." "I'm taking the word of documented evidence," Detective Hayes replied calmly. "Bank records, mail intercepts, forged signatures, false death reports, and your own recorded confession to paying for fabricated medical reports." Mrs. Finch stepped forward, her face flushed with anger. "Cedrick Vance, I've known Lucian Shaw for 40 years. I've never seen him show anything but love and pride when he talked about Genevieve. You made me believe that sweet girl was dead, and I grieved for her. I brought food to your house, and flowers to what I thought was her grave." "We all did," said another woman I didn't recognize. "How could you let us go through that? How could you accept our sympathy for something that wasn't even true?" "Because it served their purpose," I said, understanding flooding through me. Every person who believed I was dead was another person who wouldn't question why I wasn't around, wouldn't expect to see me at family events, wouldn't wonder why I wasn't caring for my grandfather. And every sympathy card, every casserole, every expression of grief, Daniel added, reinforced the lie, and made it easier to maintain. Detective Hayes was taking notes as people in the room began sharing their own experiences. Mrs. Finch talked about the memorial service she thought she'd attended. Another man described bringing flowers to what he'd been told was my grave site. A woman mentioned organizing a charity donation in my memory. "How many people did you lie to?" I asked Thalia directly. She looked around the room at faces that had transformed from sympathy to disgust, and I saw her finally understand that there was no coming back from this. "We were protecting Lucian's assets," she said quietly. "You don't understand how complicated these situations can become when families are scattered and communication breaks down.
Communication didn't break down. Detective Hayes interrupted. It was deliberately severed. There's a significant difference, legally speaking. She pulled out handcuffs and approached Cedrick, who had gone completely pale. Cedrick Vance, you're under arrest for fraud, elder abuse, mail theft and conspiracy. You have the right to remain silent, and I strongly suggest you exercise that right since everything you've said in the past hour has made your situation considerably worse. This is a mistake, Cedrick said as Detective Hayes cuffed him. You're destroying a family during their time of grief over misunderstandings and paperwork errors.
Paperwork errors don't include paying doctors to fabricate psychiatric evaluations, Detective Hayes pointed out. And misunderstandings don't involve intercepting mail and filing false death reports. She turned to Thalia. And Mrs. Vance, I'm going to need you to come with us as well. You're not under arrest at this moment, but you're definitely a person of interest in this investigation. I want a lawyer, Thalia said, her voice barely above a whisper. That's probably a good idea, Detective Hayes agreed. As they prepared to leave, Cedrick made one final desperate attempt to regain control of the narrative. You think you've won something here, Genevieve? You think exposing all this will bring your grandfather back, or erase the years you lost? I looked at him steadily. No, I think it will prevent you from doing this to another family. And I think it honors my grandfather's final request to make sure the truth came out. The truth, Cedrick laughed bitterly, is that you're about to inherit millions of dollars you didn't earn from a man you barely visited. Congratulations on your lottery ticket. That comment finally pushed me past the point of measured responses. I visited him every chance I got until you made sure I couldn't. I called him every week until you blocked my calls. I wrote him letters until you intercepted them. I loved him every day, even when I thought he'd stopped loving me back. And now, I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word, I'm going to use everything he left me to make sure no other family has to go through what we went through. I'm going to fund legal aid for families being torn apart by predators who marry into them. I'm going to create resources for elderly people who are being isolated from their real family by people who want to control their money. I looked around the room at all the faces that had witnessed this entire revelation, and I'm going to make sure everyone in this community understands exactly what happened here, so they can recognize the warning signs if it starts happening to them. Detective Hayes nodded approvingly. That sounds like an excellent use of your inheritance, Miss Finch. As she led Cedrick and Thalia toward the exit, the room remained silent until they were gone. Then conversations exploded from every corner, people comparing notes about the lies they'd been told, the sympathy they'd offered under false pretenses, the signs they might have missed. Daniel approached me with the manila envelope containing all of my grandfather's evidence. Your grandfather would be very proud of how you handled that, he said quietly. I hope so, I replied, looking around at the room full of people who now knew the truth. But I think the real work is just beginning. Mrs. Finch came over and pulled me into a fierce hug. Your grandfather talked about you constantly, she whispered. Every time I saw him, he'd ask if I'd heard from you, if I knew how you were doing. It broke my heart when I thought you'd died, and it breaks my heart even more, knowing he went through all that time thinking you'd abandoned him. But he figured out the truth, I said, holding up the envelope of evidence. And he made sure I'd know it too. Yes, she agreed. He did. Lucian Shaw always was the smartest man in any room he entered. Looking around at the faces of people who had known and loved my grandfather, I realized this wasn't just about reclaiming an inheritance or exposing fraud. It was about honoring a man who had spent his final months fighting to make sure love won over manipulation, truth won over lies, and family meant more than just shared DNA or legal documents. The confrontation was over, but the real transformation was just beginning. 3 weeks later, I sat in the mahogany-paneled office of Judge Coraline Hayes, waiting for the final ruling on my grandfather's estate. The room smelled like old leather and fresh coffee, and sunlight streamed through tall windows that probably hadn't been cleaned since the courthouse was built in 1952. Daniel Wild sat beside me, still carrying his leather portfolio, though now it contained court documents instead of funeral arrangements. The past 21 days had been a whirlwind of legal proceedings, media attention and revelations that kept expanding like ripples in a pond. What had started as a family inheritance dispute had become a criminal case involving multiple charges across 2 states, and somehow I'd found myself at the center of a story that people were calling the most elaborate case of family fraud in the county's history. Judge Hayes entered the courtroom, with the kind of measured dignity that comes from 30 years of sorting through other people's complicated messes. She was Detective Amelia Hayes's mother, as it turned out, though she'd recused herself from the criminal proceedings to avoid any appearance of conflict. The inheritance case, however, was clearly within her jurisdiction and expertise. "Miss Finch," she said, settling into her chair and opening a thick file, "I've reviewed all the evidence presented by both parties, and I'm ready to render my decision on the validity of Lucian Shaw's will." I nodded, trying to keep my expression neutral despite the fact that my heart was racing. Even though the evidence seemed overwhelming, I'd learned not to take anything for granted when it came to legal proceedings. The will, dated 6 months ago, and filed by Cedrick and Thalila Vance, contains several irregularities that raise serious questions about its authenticity. Judge Hayes continued. "Most notably, the signature analysis conducted by 3 independent experts shows clear evidence of forgery." She held up a document with side-by-side signature comparisons. "The formation of letters, the pressure patterns, and the flow of ink all indicate that someone other than Mr. Shaw signed this document. Furthermore," she continued, "the witnesses listed on this will claim they never actually witnessed Mr. Shaw sign anything. In fact, one of the supposed witnesses, Maria Santos, was out of the country on the date the will was allegedly signed." Daniel leaned over and whispered, "That's the housekeeper who quit 6 months ago because she was uncomfortable with what she was seeing." In contrast, Judge Hayes said, "The will, dated 2 weeks before Mr. Shaw's death, contains authentic signatures verified by multiple experts, was witnessed by 2 credible individuals who testified under oath, and was notarized by Mr. Shaw's longtime attorney with proper verification of mental competency." I felt a wave of relief so strong it was almost dizzying. "Therefore," Judge Hayes concluded, "I'm ruling that the later will is the authentic and legally binding final testament of Lucian Shaw. Miss Finch, you are hereby declared the rightful inheritor of the Shaw estate as outlined in that document." The ruling meant I now owned my grandfather's house, his art collection, and the majority of his investment portfolio. But more than that, it meant the legal system had officially validated everything he'd tried to tell people about what had been done to us. After the hearing, Daniel and I walked to Rosewood Corner Cafe, the same place where we'd first discussed my grandfather's evidence 3 weeks earlier. It felt appropriate to return there now that everything had been resolved. "So what's next?" Daniel asked, stirring sugar into his coffee with the same careful precision I remembered from our first meeting. "First, I need to figure out what to do with a house I never expected to own," I said. "It's beautiful, but it's also full of memories that are complicated now. Your grandfather's letter mentioned using it as a resource center." I nodded. "I've been thinking about that. There's enough space to create offices for legal aid attorneys, meeting rooms for family mediation, maybe even a small library of resources for people dealing with elder abuse or family fraud." "The Shaw Center for Family Justice," Daniel suggested. "I like that," I said. "It honors him while making it clear what the mission is." My phone buzzed with a text from Detective Amelia Hayes. "Wanted you to know that Cedrick and Thalia both accepted plea deals this morning. He gets 5 years, she gets 2 years plus restitution. They also have to pay back everything they took, plus damages." I showed the message to Daniel, who nodded approvingly. "Justice served." "It feels weird," I admitted. "I thought I'd feel more satisfied when they were finally held accountable." "What do you feel instead?" I considered the question carefully. "Sad, mostly. Sad that it came to this. Sad that my grandfather spent his final months having to be a detective instead of just being a grandfather. Sad that my mother chose money over family. But not angry anymore. No, not angry. Angry was what I felt when I didn't understand what had happened. Now that I know the truth, I mostly just feel determined." Over the following weeks, that determination took concrete form. I hired a team of contractors to convert the lower level of Lucian's house into office space for 3 attorneys who specialized in elder law and family disputes. The upstairs remained largely unchanged, serving as a reminder of the man who'd made it all possible. Mrs. Finch became an unexpected ally in the project. She'd been so horrified by her unwitting participation in the fraud that she volunteered to help coordinate community outreach. It turned out that several other families in Millbrook had experienced similar situations, though none as elaborate as mine. "The Hendersons went through something like this 2 years ago," she told me during one of our planning meetings. "Their daughter-in-law convinced them their son was too busy to visit, while telling the son they didn't want to see him anymore. By the time they figured out what was happening, they'd lost almost a year of relationship." "That's exactly the kind of situation this center could help with," I said. "Early intervention before things escalate to criminal fraud." The media attention had been intense but ultimately helpful. 3 different news programs had done features on family fraud and elder abuse, using my grandfather's case as an example of how elaborate these schemes could become. Several other victims had come forward after seeing the coverage, and a network of attorneys and social workers was beginning to form around the issue. One afternoon, about 6 weeks after the funeral, I was working in what had been my grandfather's study when I found something I'd missed during my initial examination of his papers. Tucked behind a framed photo of us together when I was 15 was an envelope addressed simply to my dear Genevieve. Inside was a letter dated just 1 week before his death. If you're reading this, then you've won and I couldn't be prouder. Not because you got the money or the house, but because you stood up for the truth even when it was difficult and painful. I've been thinking about legacy a lot these past few months. I used to think legacy was about what you left behind, but I've come to understand that it's really about what you inspire other people to do. The money and property I'm leaving you are tools, nothing more. What you do with those tools will be my real legacy. I know you'll use them well. I know you'll help other families avoid what we went through. And I know you'll understand that love isn't always easy to recognize, but it's always worth fighting for. Thank you for giving an old man the chance to feel useful in his final months. Planning this entire operation gave me purpose when I thought my purpose was finished. All my love, always and forever, Grandpa Lucian. P.S. Check the false bottom of my desk drawer. There's one more surprise I think you'll appreciate. I found the hidden compartment easily enough, remembering how Lucian had shown me the secret when I was 8 years old and sworn me to secrecy about his treasure hiding place. Inside was a small velvet box containing a ring I'd never seen before. The accompanying note explained that it had belonged to my grandmother, his first wife who died when I was too young to remember her. He'd been saving it not for any romantic purpose, but because he wanted me to have something that connected me to the family history that predated all the complications with Thalia and Cedrick. She would have loved you, the note said. She would have been proud of your strength and your compassion just like I am. That evening, I called the one person I hadn't spoken to since the funeral, my mother. She was still awaiting trial, though her attorney had negotiated a plea deal similar to Cedrick's. When she answered, her voice sounded smaller than I remembered. "Genevieve," she said, and I could hear tears in her voice. "I wasn't sure you'd ever call. I wasn't sure I would either," I admitted. "But I needed to tell you something." "What's that?" "I forgive you." The silence that followed lasted so long I thought she might have hung up. "I don't deserve that," she finally said. "Forgiveness isn't about what you deserve. It's about what I need to move forward, and I need to stop carrying anger that belongs to you, not me." "Does this mean you want a relationship again?" I considered the question carefully. "I don't know yet, maybe someday, but not while you're still married to Cedrick, and not until you've done the work to understand how you let this happen." "He's filing for divorce," she said quietly. "His attorney says it will help with his sentence if he can show the marriage was ending anyway. That's probably smart strategy for him. But what about you? Are you filing because it's legally advantageous, or because you finally understand what he really is?" Another long pause. "Both, I think. I keep trying to figure out when I stopped being your mother and started being his accomplice. I know that's what happened, but I can't pinpoint the moment when I chose him over you. Maybe that's something you can work on during your time away." "Maybe," she agreed. "Genevieve. Yeah, your grandfather really did love you more than anything. Even when he was angry with me, even when he was disappointed in the choices I'd made, he never stopped talking about how proud he was of you." "I know," I said. He made sure I'd know. After we hung up, I sat in Lucian's study, now my study, surrounded by the evidence of a life well lived and a love that had survived even deliberate attempts to destroy it. The Shaw Center for Family Justice would open in 2 months, with 3 attorneys, 2 social workers, and a mission to prevent other families from going through what we'd experienced. It wasn't the life I'd planned when I'd driven 12 hours to attend my grandfather's funeral. But as I looked around at the space that was becoming something new while honoring something old, I realized it might be exactly the life I was meant to live. My grandfather had turned his death into a beginning. Now it was my turn to see what I could build with the foundation he'd left me. 1 year later, I stood in the main conference room of the Shaw Center for Family Justice, watching a woman named Camille Sterling wipe away tears of relief as attorney Joanne Hayes explained that her stepson's attempt to have her declared mentally incompetent had been successfully challenged. It was the same pattern we'd seen dozens of times, a vulnerable person being isolated from support systems while predators maneuvered to control their assets. "I can't believe it's over," Camille said, clutching the legal documents that restored her rights. 6 months ago, I thought I was losing my mind because my own stepson was telling everyone I had dementia.
It's not over, Joanne corrected gently. It's beginning. Now you get to rebuild the relationships they tried to destroy. I smiled, remembering how those same words had felt when Daniel first explained my grandfather's plan. The Shaw Center had helped 43 families in its first year of operation, preventing financial fraud, reuniting family members who'd been deliberately separated, and providing legal resources for people who couldn't afford to fight back on their own. After Camille left, I walked through the center, checking on the various programs we'd developed. The legal aid office was busy with 3 attorneys handling cases across the region. The family mediation room hosted weekly sessions for relatives working to rebuild relationships damaged by manipulation. The resource library contained everything from financial planning guides to therapeutic materials for people recovering from family betrayal. But my favorite space was the small memorial room dedicated to Lucian Shaw. His portrait hung on the wall next to a simple plaque, "For families separated by lies, reunited by truth." Visitors often left notes sharing their own stories of family manipulation and recovery. Mrs. Finch found me there, carrying a fresh bouquet of white roses for the memorial table. At 78, she'd become the center's volunteer coordinator and unofficial grandmother figure for everyone who walked through our doors. "How's our latest success story feeling?" she asked, arranging the flowers carefully. "Grateful, overwhelmed, and ready to start healing," I said. "Just like I was a year ago. Your grandfather would be so proud of what you've built here." "We built," I corrected. "None of this would work without the community support." It was true. The center operated on a combination of inheritance funds, community donations, and grants from organizations that had learned about our work through media coverage. 3 other communities were planning similar centers based on our model, and I'd been invited to speak at conferences about family fraud prevention. My phone buzzed with a text from Detective Amelia Hayes. "Update on your case. Cedrick was denied parole. Thalia gets out next month, but violation of her plea agreement means she can't contest the restitution order." I showed the message to Mrs. Finch, who nodded approvingly. "Justice moving slowly but surely." "I heard from my mother last week," I said. "She's been attending therapy sessions and says she wants to make amends when she's released." "How do you feel about that?" "Cautious but hopeful. The therapist she's working with specializes in people who've been manipulated into betraying their own families. Apparently it's more common than anyone wants to admit. Will you see her when she gets out?" "Maybe. In a neutral location, with clear boundaries. I've learned that forgiveness doesn't require forgetting, and family doesn't mean accepting harmful behavior." That afternoon, I had my monthly video call with Daniel Wild, who'd moved to another state but stayed involved with the center as an advisory board member. He was calling from his new funeral home, and I could see familiar legal portfolios on his desk. "We've got another situation developing here," he said. "Family claiming the deceased daughter-in-law is mentally unstable while blocking her from the funeral and filing for control of her inheritance." Sound familiar? Unfortunately, yes. Are they using the same playbook? Almost word for word. Fake mental health claims, intercepted mail, stories about drug addiction that can't be verified. Send me the details. Joanne can probably recommend someone in your area who specializes in this kind of case. Already did. I also sent them copies of your grandfather's letters and the center's resource materials. Sometimes people just need to know they're not alone, and that there are legal options. That evening, I sat in what had been my grandfather's study, now my office, working on a book about family fraud that a publisher had asked me to write. The working title was Love Letters from the Grave: How One Grandfather's Final Plan Exposed Family Fraud and Inspired a Movement. On my desk sat the ring that had belonged to my grandmother, next to a framed photo of Lucian and me at my college graduation. But the item I treasured most was a handwritten note from a teenage girl whose grandmother was being isolated by relatives who wanted her property. The note simply said, "Thank you for proving that someone can fight back and win." As I worked on the chapter about rebuilding trust after family betrayal, I thought about all the things my grandfather had taught me, both while he was alive and through the evidence he'd left behind. The most important lesson wasn't about money or legal strategies. It was that love sometimes requires courage, and protecting people sometimes means fighting the very people who claim to love them. The Shaw Center would continue operating long after I was gone, funded by an endowment that ensured its mission would survive. But more than that, it had already inspired similar centers in other communities, creating a network of resources for people facing family manipulation. My grandfather had spent his final months turning his death into a tool for justice. He'd proven that even when someone tries to erase you from their story, love leaves traces that can't be destroyed by lies or legal documents. I'd learned that family isn't defined by genetics or marriage certificates. It's defined by who stands up for you when you can't stand up for yourself, who tells the truth when others choose comfortable lies, and who plans for your future even when they won't be there to see it. If you're watching this and something similar has happened to you, know that you're not alone. Check the description for resources, legal aid contacts, and remember that your story isn't over just because someone tried to erase you from theirs. And if you suspect someone you love is being isolated or manipulated, don't wait for perfect proof. Sometimes love means asking uncomfortable questions and refusing to accept convenient explanations. My grandfather taught me that the strongest inheritance isn't money. It's the knowledge that someone loved you enough to fight for you, even from beyond the grave. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.